Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world that's part history lesson, part cautionary tale, and part wait, people actually did that? So before you get cozy, maybe dim the lights, grab a blanket and sip something warm. And if you enjoy the weirdness of history as much as I do, hit like and subscribe. Seriously, I'm curious, where are you tuning in from and what time is it for you? It's always fun to see who's joining this slightly chaotic journey across centuries. Now let's take a deep breath and imagine Europe in the Middle Ages. Castles rising from the mist, markets bustling with merchants shouting over the clatter of hooves, and a world where superstition, fear, and authority mixed in ways that could make your modern-day worries feel downright sane. It's the kind of time when laws weren't just rules on paper. They were absolute, bizarre, and sometimes deadly. Life back then was complicated. Survival was already a full-time job between crop failures, feuds, and, well, the occasional dragon-sized exaggeration in storytelling. But even beyond the daily grind, there were certain things you just didn't do. Or at least you didn't do them if you wanted to stay alive. And the reason? Sometimes the tiniest misstep could get you in big trouble. The kind of trouble that came with a dramatic and often fatal ending. You see, the Middle Ages weren't exactly known for their subtlety and justice. People didn't get a slap on the wrist or a fine for stepping out of line. No, punishment was a full sensory experience, painful, public, and designed to make everyone else think twice. And yet, for all the fearsome methods and terrifying laws, some of the reasons people were executed were, let's just say, questionably dumb. Imagine for a moment living in a village where everyone knows everyone else's business. A sneeze in the wrong place, a remark misunderstood, or a chicken wandering into the wrong field could spark gossip that escalated far beyond what seems reasonable. Now mix in strict social hierarchies, religious fervor, and a judicial system that sometimes relied on omens, superstition, or just gut feelings, and you start to see how precarious life could be. Some historians argue that the Middle Ages were all about maintaining order and obedience. But here's the kicker. Sometimes the laws themselves were bafflingly specific. Offenses that seem trivial, silly, or even downright absurd today could earn a person a spot on the execution block. And yes, we're going to get into some of those cases tonight. Before we jump in, picture this. A bustling medieval town square, wooden scaffolds, ropes, and a crowd gathered not for a festival but for what was essentially a public lesson in what not to do. And the reason someone might end up there? Something like insulting the wrong person, failing to attend church properly, or even being too good at something like making a better sword than the local blacksmith. These were everyday dangers that could, without warning, turn fatal. Now, let's pause for a second and imagine the mindset. The Middle Ages were an era when fear, religion, and social hierarchy intertwined like a carefully woven tapestry. People believed that misdeeds, no matter how minor, could invite divine wrath or worse, anger a king, a lord, or a town council. And so justice was often swift, public, and final. But here's the part that gets really interesting. Not all executions were for grand political reasons or massive betrayals. No, many were triggered by something stupidly trivial, by mistakes that modern people would shrug off, laugh at, or post about on social media with a sarcastic emoji. And yet, in their time, these actions were treated with deadly seriousness. Take the example of someone accused of talking back to a noble. Today, that might earn a stern look or a passive-aggressive email. In the Middle Ages, if your timing was bad or if the noble was having a particularly bad day, that could be reason enough to face a court, a trial, and potentially a public execution. Or consider a farmer who accidentally harvested someone else's crop. Today it's called a dispute, maybe small claims court. Back then, property was sacred, tied not just to wealth, but to survival. And stepping on that invisible line could mean fines, beatings, or worse. Yes, some people were executed simply for crossing boundaries that seem ridiculous today, and then there were the superstitious cases. Illness, crop failure, or a random bad omen could be blamed on a person, often someone who didn't fit neatly into society's expectations. Witches, outcasts, or anyone who behaved unusually might suddenly find themselves accused of crimes they didn't even understand. The result, a public execution. Not because of anything truly harmful, but because fear made people desperate to assign blame. And yet, for all the absurdity, there was a certain logic, twisted though it may seem. Authorities believed that punishment, especially when public, served as a lesson for everyone else. If the penalty was extreme, it was meant to scare others into obedience. In that sense, even the dumbest reasons for execution had a method behind the madness, designed to maintain social order through fear. By now, you might be wondering how we can even begin to list the silliest reasons people were executed without the story becoming a grim countdown of misery. The key is to approach it like an anthropologist, with a sense of dark humor. We'll look at these cases not to glorify them, but to marvel at the creativity of fear and law in medieval society. And just to keep things gentle and soft tonight, picture these events with a bit of imagination. Hear the crowd murmuring, the clatter of horses, the rustle of robes. Smell the faint smoke from torches, the scent of damp wood and stone. Imagine the tension, the absurdity, and the human desire to follow rules, even when the rules are ridiculous. All right, now that we're settled into the Middle Ages and the slightly terrifying rules of the time, let's get into the first batch of absurd reasons people met their end. And remember, these weren't ordinary punishments for ordinary crimes. No, these were cases where you'd think, wait, they executed someone for that? Let's start with something almost comical. Bad fashion choices. You might be imagining someone walking into a medieval court wearing neon tights or a glittery hat. Not quite. But medieval authorities were strangely obsessed with clothing regulations. Wearing the wrong color, fabric, or style could be considered a challenge to the social hierarchy. For example, certain fabrics, like silk or specific colors, were reserved for the elite. If a commoner dared to show up in silk, well, they could face fines, beatings, or, in extreme cases, execution. Yes, a piece of cloth could literally be a death sentence. Then there's the case of people being punished for talking too much or too little. In one story, a man was executed simply because he refused to speak during a trial. Silence, which today we'd call legal strategy, was back then seen as insubordination or defiance. He wasn't guilty of murder or theft. He just didn't answer when expected. That was enough for the executioner. Imagine getting executed because you were introverted. Medieval social anxiety solved permanently. Now, let's move on to a slightly stranger reason. Being accused of witchcraft for mundane behavior. One woman, living in a small village, liked to bake extra bread and give it to neighbors. Simple kindness, right? In the eyes of her suspicious community, though, she was meddling with forces she shouldn't understand. Her generosity was twisted into magical interference, and she faced trial. And yes, it ended in execution. Generosity apparently was dangerous. Another case that really makes you wonder about the logic of medieval courts involved cats. Cats, beloved creatures to many, were sometimes linked to witchcraft or the devil. One unfortunate man was accused of feeding his cat at night, which neighbors claimed was suspicious behavior. The local authorities didn't exactly investigate thoroughly. They decided the act was proof of evil association. And, as grim as it sounds, the small, innocent act became part of his death sentence. But it wasn't just personal habits or kindness that could get you killed. Some people were executed for accidental accidents, things that today might earn a scolding or a lawsuit. For instance, if a horse escaped from your stable and trampled someone's prized vegetable patch, you could be in serious trouble. Not just fines, but full-on public punishment. Sometimes the Middle Ages didn't see accidents as accidents. They were often seen as signs of divine displeasure or negligence so severe it warranted a permanent lesson. And then there's the case of misunderstood words. Imagine walking down the street, muttering to yourself, and someone overhears you. Perhaps you said something like, "I wish my neighbor's goat would stop stealing my cabbage." Today, that's a grumble about vegetables. Back then, your words could be twisted into threats, heresy, or sedition. miscommunication was deadly. One man was executed because someone claimed he was plotting against a noble based purely on a misheard conversation. Here's another odd one. People executed for failing to laugh or show emotion at the right time. In certain courts, humor, or even solemnity, was heavily regulated. A poorly timed joke could be interpreted as disrespect toward a lord, and a lack of mourning at a funeral could be seen as indifference to social duty. In these situations, feelings, or the lack thereof, became a matter of life and death. It's a bit hard to imagine, right, that your emotional state could literally get you executed. And speaking of emotions, there were cases where public displays of grief went too far. Someone might cry too loudly, too theatrically, or in the wrong manner during a public ceremony, and that could be read as mockery, defiance, or rebellion. In the extreme, it could lead to execution. Imagine sobbing at a funeral and being punished because your tears were excessive. The Middle Ages were not kind to overachievers of sentiment. Let's take a small pause here and picture these scenes. Villagers whispering behind hands, guards watching every gesture, and an executioner waiting for what seems like the tiniest misstep. The tension, the fear, and yes, the absurdity, all combined into a world where survival required not just caution, but a constant, almost comical attention to the tiniest details. And yet, for all this absurdity, there was a sort of twisted logic behind it. Medieval authorities believed that if you allowed small offenses to go unpunished, they could escalate into rebellion, chaos, or moral decay. So, in their minds, executing someone for saying the wrong thing, feeding a cat, or wearing the wrong color was actually a form of social maintenance. It's not that they were cruel for no reason. They genuinely thought they were keeping society safe. Now, don't get me wrong. There were many horrific executions in the Middle Ages for crimes like theft, murder, and treason. But what fascinates and sometimes horrifies is the sheer absurdity of some punishments. These were people who lived or died not based on the severity of their actions, but on how those actions were interpreted, misinterpreted, or simply disliked by those in power. And this is where our story gets even more interesting. Over time, certain bizarre patterns emerge. People are executed for tiny mistakes, personal quirks, or just being unlucky in the eyes of a judge or lord. It's a world where perception often mattered more than reality, where fear amplified misunderstandings, and where the line between reasonable punishment and utter nonsense was razor thin. All right, now that we've warmed up with the slightly absurd, let's get into the truly ridiculous reasons people were executed in the Middle Ages. These are the cases that make you question reality, wonder if the judges were asleep, or maybe just a little evil. First, let's talk about executions for laughing at the wrong time. Yes, you heard that right. In one story, a young servant was attending a public ceremony, trying to keep his composure, when he accidentally let out a small laugh. It wasn't mocking anyone, it wasn't even particularly loud, but in the eyes of the noble in charge, it was a direct insult to authority. And the punishment? Execution. Sometimes the tiniest smile or chuckle could be fatal. Imagine living in a world where joy could literally kill you. And there's the case of mirrors. Mirrors were rare, precious, and slightly magical in the eyes of medieval people. One unlucky woman owned a mirror that reflected her beauty, or so they claimed. Her neighbors accused her of witchcraft, saying the mirror allowed her to trap souls or talk to spirits. She was put on trial, and yes, executed. Just owning a reflective surface could cost you your life. That's a whole new level of be careful what you buy. Now let's move on to jokes about the nobility. Humor was dangerous back then. One man, at a village feast, made a passing joke about a nobleman's beard. Nothing cruel, nothing harmful, just a little comment about its size and shape. Word got back to the noble, and the man was immediately arrested. It didn't matter that the joke was mild. He had insulted authority, and in the Middle Ages, that was a crime punishable by death. So next time you're tempted to make fun of your boss, just remember this story. And it wasn't just jokes. People were executed for complaining about the weather. In some records, farmers who criticized a noble for poor rainfall or bad harvests were accused of sowing dissent, Their words apparently could influence public opinion or anger the heavens. The punishment? Sometimes execution. Talking about clouds could get you killed. Wild, right? Then we have accusations of wrongful staring. You might think that glancing at someone funny is harmless, but in medieval times it could be considered witchcraft, sorcery, or seduction. One young man was executed because he looked too intently at a noblewoman. That's right, his eyes alone were considered dangerous. No magic wand, no crime scene, just an unfortunate gaze. Another story involves singing the wrong song. Music was strictly controlled during ceremonies. One bard, trying to entertain, sang a song that authorities considered disrespectful to a lord or religious figure. The lyrics weren't threatening, just a little off message. He was executed, leaving a silent village behind. Imagine rehearsing your set for weeks only to have your voice condemned to history in the most final way possible. And then there's the case of cows. Yes, cows. Livestock could be a huge deal in medieval economies, and some rulers treated them almost like gold. One farmer accidentally let a noble's prized cow wander into another field. Instead of fines or labor compensation, the farmer was executed. A cow grazing incorrectly led to a public death sentence. It's absurd, but it shows how property and hierarchy outweighed common sense. We can't forget clapping or cheering at the wrong moment. In some courtly events, spontaneous applause or reactions could be read as mockery or rebellion. People who clapped when they weren't supposed to, maybe celebrating a minor victory, or just caught up in excitement, sometimes found themselves facing execution. Fun, celebration, or joy was dangerous territory. Now, here's a strange one. People executed for accidental theft. This could mean taking something by mistake, maybe grabbing the wrong loaf of bread at a market or picking up someone else's tool. The courts didn't always believe it was an accident. If they decided you intended to steal, even unknowingly, execution could follow. That's like modern justice saying, oops, wrong cart, death penalty. And let's take a moment to picture this world. People walking carefully, thinking about every glance, word, and action. Nervous laughter at a festival could get you killed. A misplaced mirror could end your life. A cow stepping in the wrong field? That could be the last thing you ever did. It's equal parts terrifying and absurd, isn't it? Here's the pattern. The Middle Ages were obsessed with control, hierarchy, and superstition. Anything that disrupted the perceived order, words, actions, even thoughts, could be twisted into a capital offense. And the punishments weren't always logical. Often it was about sending a message. Don't think differently. Don't act differently. Don't even exist differently. But amid the horror, there's also this darkly humorous side. Because reading these stories now, you can't help but shake your head, smirk nervously, and think, wait, they actually executed people for that? And the truth is, they did. Hundreds of years of society, rules, and fear distilled into moments of pure, absurd, human tragedy. All right. Now let's move even further into the bizarre and superstitious side of medieval justice. If you thought people were executed just for laughing or staring too much, buckle up, things get even stranger. One of the most common reasons people ended up on the chopping block was being unlucky. That's right. If someone had a string of bad luck, neighbors might whisper, and soon enough, a local lord could accuse them of cursing the community. Sometimes all it took was a failed harvest, a sick animal, or even someone slipping on the cobblestones. Somehow, the unlucky person became responsible for all misfortune, and the penalty could be death. Imagine living your life knowing that spilling a bucket of water could be your doom. Then there's executions for bad omens or dreams. People in the Middle Ages truly believed that certain dreams or signs from nature were messages from God or the spirits. If someone reported a dream where, say, a black bird landed on the village well, or the moon appeared red, authorities might declare that person a prophet of doom or witch, and that could easily lead to execution. Sharing your dreams, dangerous. Thinking too much, even more dangerous. Noise was another surprisingly deadly factor. Sneezing, shouting, or singing in the wrong place could be considered a serious offense. In one town, a man sneezed during a court hearing, His sneeze was interpreted as mocking the judge's wisdom, and he was executed. Yes, sneezing. Today, we say bless you, and back then, it could get you killed. Let's talk about misunderstood gestures. Even a simple wave could be deadly. In some cases, people were executed for pointing fingers or raising their hands. Those gestures could be interpreted as curses, threats, or challenges to authority. Picture walking down a crowded street trying to get someone's attention, and suddenly you're seen as a threat to the entire kingdom. That was real life back then. Now the Middle Ages loved to blame women. One of the strangest examples involves accusations based on smells. If a woman's body or even her home had a strange odor, maybe from cooking, herbs, or natural body scents, she could be accused of witchcraft or being in league with demons. And yes, that could end in execution. Your natural scent was considered dangerous. And don't forget the animals as witnesses. Believe it or not, animals could indirectly lead to executions. If a pig ran loose and trampled a noble's garden, the owner of the pig could be accused of negligence or causing harm. In some extreme cases, people were executed because the animal was considered a tool of evil forces. Yes, your neighbor's goat could get you killed. One of the more famous examples involves execution by trial of ordeal. People accused of minor crimes were sometimes forced to undergo absurd tests to prove their innocence, like carrying hot iron, swimming while bound, or walking blindfolded over sharp stones. Failing meant death. Success meant survival. It was a system designed less for justice and more for entertainment and fear. And we can't skip superstitions about food. Eating the wrong thing on the wrong day, serving a dish in the wrong way, or even sharing bread with the wrong person could be seen as breaking sacred rules. There are records of people executed for things like accidentally serving the king a spoiled meal. Talk about a kitchen nightmare. Medieval towns also had this strange obsession with numbers. And if someone broke a pattern like using the wrong number of ingredients in a ritual, building stairs with the wrong number of steps, or planting crops in an incorrect alignment, they could be accused of angering the gods. In some cases, the punishment was death. Planning your day carefully not enough. You also needed numerology on your side. And then there's the case of accidental insults. Back then, a simple misunderstanding could escalate. Maybe you bowed too low or not low enough. Maybe your hat was slightly crooked. Maybe you called someone sir when they wanted lord. These tiny mistakes could be read as deliberate disrespect, and sometimes execution was the result. It's wild to think that etiquette could literally be a death sentence, but it wasn't all superstition or gestures. Sometimes people were executed for trying to defend themselves. One account tells of a man who was attacked by a noble's guards, defended himself, and was accused of assaulting the noble. The result, execution. The irony here is brutal. Trying to survive could get you killed faster than the original threat. Another bizarre reason was dreaming about someone powerful. Dreams weren't private thoughts, they were considered prophetic or threatening. If a dream suggested that a noble might die or a rebellion could happen, the dreamer could be executed for conspiring against fate. Your subconscious could literally get you killed. And we can't forget accidental public displays of affection. Kissing, holding hands, or even hugging in the wrong place could be seen as scandalous, threatening, or sinful, and sometimes punished by execution. Love was dangerous. Friendship was dangerous. Basically, breathing in public could be dangerous. Now, you might be thinking, surely this was rare, right? Well, it wasn't exactly common, but these stories weren't anomalies. They're documented in legal texts, chronicles, and personal accounts. The Middle Ages were a world obsessed with control, hierarchy, and superstition. Life was fragile, arbitrary, and sometimes downright absurd. So, take a moment, breathe, and imagine a medieval village. Cobblestone streets, torchlight flickering on stone walls, the constant murmur of townsfolk nervously whispering to avoid mistakes. Every laugh, sneeze, glance, or gesture could tip the balance between life and death. Fear wasn't just emotional, it was institutionalized. And humor? Humor was a tiny, dangerous rebellion. Now, as we tiptoe further into the world of medieval justice, brace yourself. because some of the reasons people were executed weren't just strange. They were so absurd you'd swear they were a bad joke. Let's start with executions for magical threats. People didn't need to actually do magic. Nope, if someone looked suspicious, wore the wrong clothes, or had a peculiar book, they could be accused of witchcraft or sorcery. And guess what? Magic, according to medieval law, was a capital offense. Even a poorly drawn circle or an oddly shaped candle could be interpreted as conspiring against God or the king. Speaking of odd items, imagine being accused of a crime simply because of your possessions. Carrying a book, a certain herb, or even a small animal could be considered suspicious evidence. There's a story of a man executed because he had a cat. Not an evil-looking cat, just a normal, fluffy cat. Somehow that feline became proof of nefarious intent. The Middle Ages didn't always care if something was intentional. For instance, spilling wine on a noble's robe could lead to trial and execution. Sneezing on a sacred relic? Execution. Standing too close to a bishop? Execution. Honestly, it was like living in a world where air itself was dangerous. Now, you might be wondering about punishments beyond execution. Medieval societies were wildly creative. Take the scold's bridle, for example. This was a metal mask put on women accused of nagging or gossiping. It included a piece of metal that went into the mouth to prevent talking. Sometimes it had spikes. Imagine sitting at dinner, trying to whisper to your friend, and realizing the metal spikes are stabbing your tongue. That was social correction. Then there's public humiliation as punishment. Some people were forced to wear ridiculous outfits or signs declaring their crimes. One man accused of theft had to parade around town wearing a giant wooden pig. Another had to wear a donkey mask for an entire week. While these weren't executions, the public shaming could ruin lives, sometimes even leading to death, if someone offended the wrong noble while wearing their humiliating costume. Medieval authorities also loved creative torture methods to encourage confessions. There was the breaking wheel, where someone was tied to a large wheel and had their limbs shattered. Then the wheel would be raised, and the person left to die slowly. Brutal, yes, but in some cases the reason for the execution was minor theft or arguing with a noble. Imagine all that pain because you tried to take an extra loaf of bread. One of the more surreal punishments was the blood eagle, recorded in some Norse accounts. The victim's back would be cut open, ribs broken, and lungs pulled out to form wings. And what was the crime? Sometimes political betrayal, sometimes unclear. Records are sketchy, but the level of ritualized violence is striking. And then there's the execution by animals. Lions, bears, and dogs were sometimes used to kill prisoners. The logic? If the accused survived, they were blessed or favored by. If not, well, justice was served. This was particularly popular in medieval arenas and festivals, where execution became part of entertainment. Imagine watching a legal proceeding and then suddenly a lion appears. Talk about raising the stakes. Some punishments weren't lethal but were still utterly absurd. For instance, in parts of Europe, people were executed for mismatched shoes or walking backwards in the streets. Rules about appearances and behavior were so strict that tiny infractions could spiral into capital punishment. Fashion, it seems, was serious business. Another mind-boggling example is execution by trial of animals. Yes, animals were sometimes put on trial for crimes. If a pig attacked someone, the pig could be executed, and its owner sometimes faced death too. If a rat destroyed stored grain, heads rolled, sometimes literally. The logic was rooted in superstition and communal blame, but the absurdity is undeniable, and we haven't even touched the death by ridicule yet. Some courts would sentence people to a slow, humiliating death for minor social transgressions like mocking a noble or spreading rumors. Victims could be paraded, pelted with rotten food, or forced to endure public insults before execution. Sometimes the execution itself was designed to make the person feel humiliated to the very end. The thing to remember is that in medieval Europe, fear was a tool. Authorities didn't just want people to follow the law, they wanted them to internalize terror. And what better way to do that than punish people for reasons that seem incomprehensible to us today? You might be wondering, how did people cope? Humor, of course. Medieval literature is full of jokes and stories mocking the absurdity of authority. But those jokes were often whispered, shared in secret, because saying them too loudly could also get you executed. Irony, sarcasm, and satire were all survival tactics. Finally, let's talk about the psychology of it all. Living in a society where any sneeze, gesture, or dream could lead to execution had profound effects on daily life. People learned to watch their words, monitor their movements, and live in constant anxiety. It's hard to imagine now, but in such a world, even simple pleasure, laughing at a joke, enjoying a drink, or walking with a friend was risky. So, in summary, the Middle Ages were a world where arbitrary rules, superstition, and fear ruled daily life. People were executed for minor, absurd, or invisible offenses. Animals, gestures, dreams, and even bad luck could decide your fate. It's a world that seems almost comically cruel, but it was real, and millions lived under its shadow. Now it's time to step into the peak of medieval absurdity, the executions that make you wonder how anyone survived long enough to complain about taxes. These stories are equal parts horrifying and, frankly, unbelievable. Let's start with one of the classics, the infamous ducking stool. This was mainly used for women accused of gossiping, nagging, or being generally unruly. They'd be strapped to a chair, often with a big wooden frame, and dunked repeatedly into a river or pond. Sometimes the punishment went on until the accused drowned. What's wild is that talking too much could literally get you killed. Imagine your weekly book club turning deadly just because someone didn't like your opinion on the herbs in your stew. Next, we have execution by boiling. Yes, you heard that right. People were literally lowered into giant cauldrons of boiling water or oil. And what could earn you this steamy fate? Stealing chickens, fraud, minor robbery, even lying about the weather in some regions. The combination of pain, terror, and the absurdity of the crime makes you question if these judges ever took a day off to think things through. And then there's the ever-popular hanging, drawing, and quartering used in England for traitors. Victims were hanged, disemboweled, and then cut into pieces. Truly horrifying. But sometimes the treason was nothing more than not showing enough respect to a local lord or accidentally insulting someone powerful. One poor soul supposedly offended a noble by bringing the wrong kind of bread to yet the punishment was treated with utmost seriousness. Now, let's take a slightly comedic turn with the heretic's chair. This wasn't actually a chair for sitting, it was a metal contraption with spikes designed to slowly impale or crush the unlucky soul who dared challenge church authority. It's hard to imagine being in a meeting thinking this is uncomfortable and then realizing, oh, I'm literally about to die for having an opinion. Some punishments weren't directly lethal, but were insanely humiliating, like the drunkard's cloak. Misbehaving men would be placed inside a barrel, often with holes cut for the head and arms, and paraded around town while neighbors laughed. Sometimes people were forced to wear shame masks or pig heads while their crimes were read aloud. The social pressure could be deadly in its own way, especially if someone got mob lynched by an angry crowd. Speaking of animals again, there are records of executions involving dogs trained to attack humans. Imagine being tied up while a pack of hungry dogs approaches, all because you argued with a local official, or lions in public arenas, where your life could literally depend on whether you looked interesting enough to the spectators or to the king. Medieval authorities had a flair for mixing terror with theatre, and nothing was too small to make a spectacle of. Then there's the truly bizarre case of being executed for laughter. In some areas, people accused of mocking the king, the clergy, or local officials could be hanged, strangled, or otherwise killed. Even a joke at the wrong time could lead to capital punishment. That's right, funny or clever could be lethal. Comedy was dangerous, and timing was everything. One of the most extreme examples comes from France, where a man was executed for giving a sermon in his garden without a license. It wasn't heresy. It wasn't political. It was simply that authorities didn't approve, and yet he lost his life. Imagine gardening and suddenly realizing that your peaceful hobby has fatal consequences. We also have examples of execution by starvation, often for debt or minor theft. People were thrown into tiny cells, sometimes locked in cages, and left to die slowly. And why? In many cases because someone wanted to make a point about obedience or property rights. It's hard not to feel a little incredulous hungry, slowly dying, all because of a missing loaf of bread. Another astonishing category is punishments tied to bizarre rules about speech or clothing. People could be executed for wearing the wrong color, cutting their hair a certain way, or even speaking out of turn in court. Entire communities lived under these arbitrary rules, knowing that one slip up a word, a gesture, a choice in wardrobe could end their lives. And of course, we can't forget the ritualized executions meant to scare the population, like impalement or being placed on a gibbet to slowly die from exposure. These were often reserved for minor nobility or rebels, but sometimes ordinary citizens were caught in the crossfire. The idea was to make people remember the price of disobedience. It's chilling to imagine walking through a town and seeing someone displayed as a warning, thinking, that could be me tomorrow. Yet despite all this, people still joked, laughed, and made the best of it. Medieval literature and folklore are full of dark humor, poking fun at absurd punishments. The irony is that humor was often a survival mechanism. Even in a world where one misstep could be fatal, people found ways to mock the system, whispering jokes and sharing stories that risked another punishment if overheard. And as the Middle Ages drew to a close, some of these absurd executions slowly faded, but the legacy lingered. People remembered the stories, the fear, and the incredible creativity of cruelty. It's a reminder that human history isn't just about kings, wars, and politics. It's also about the bizarre, the arbitrary, and sometimes the ridiculous ways societies have tried to enforce control. So, as we end our journey into the dumbest reasons people were executed in the Middle Ages, take a moment to breathe. Reflect on how fortunate we are not to live in a world where spilled wine, talking too much, or owning a cat could cost you your life. And maybe, just maybe, appreciate that even in the darkest times, people found ways to laugh, survive, and leave stories for us to tell centuries later. Because in the end, history isn't just dates and battles, it's the human experience, full of fear, absurdity, courage, and yes, the occasional ridiculous execution. And now, the next time you complain about a minor inconvenience or awkward social faux pas, just remember, someone, somewhere, in the Middle Ages, paid the ultimate price for something far dumber than that. Take a deep breath, relax, and let this story settle. The Middle Ages may have been brutal, chaotic, and bizarre, but they also remind us that humans are strangely resilient, endlessly creative, and often absurdly lucky to survive another day.